The calendar took down a thin black serif like any other fall note, but for our family that evening became a hinge. The light had that indecisive quality of early autumn, neither the bright certainties of high summer nor the hard clarity of winter, but a light that makes a room feel both intimate and exposed outside. The air carried the hollow sweet smell of drying leaves and the distant on television at kitchen tables sat in the background like a radio you could not quite turn down. Inside our house the concerns were domestic, immediate. The ordinary domestic traffic of small people and obligations and histories. They were not less important because they were private. Private harm has the same gravity as public strife. Our wedding had been only weeks earlier. Late August 2003, a low-key affair among family and friends. In those first evenings after the ceremony, the rhythms of celebration still hummed. Glasses that would not quite empty, introductions that got easier with repeat encores, the awkward politeness that is its own kind of endurance. By early September the leaves were beginning to thin, and on a particular evening in September 2003 a man from my past asked if he could return most nights to our living room. He did not demand entry, he did not pound on the door, he asked in the soft way people use when they suspect their request might be refused. Could I come by? Sometimes he had kept the old cadence, the practiced ease that used to feel like home. His voice unmoored a younger version of myself. That self who would have opened the door without a second thought, who preferred smoothing the surface to holding the truth, jagged and present in that era, when social networks were just beginning to reshape how acquaintance and intimacy worked. Some reconnections were as simple as a click. Our reconnection felt different because the cost was not merely an awkward dinner, it was safety. I did not open the door, I said the words out loud, steady and small. No, not now, not this way. That refusal was not a theatrical denunciation, it was not a final slam of judgment, it was a demarcation. A boundary drawn at the threshold. It aimed to protect children who moved through the house in small, unaccountable ways. Unaware of the ledgers, adults kept. The refusal functioned as caretaking. Rather than punishment, it said, we will not expose our children to the patterns that once arrived like an unanticipated autumn storm. He took the refusal like a sudden wind. Hurt surfaced in his face. Bewilderment folded into anger. He tried to reconcile his sense of the world with the rules we had set. He accused us of cruelty. He gestured toward old familiarity, as if past patterns might still be a place to live. I did not try to soothe him that night. My duty was not to cure loneliness, it was to keep a covenant. An unadorned promise to the people who lacked the power to leave harm behind them. At the wedding a month earlier, a child had cut through adult equivocation with an axe-like clarity. A young friend of my daughter's asked, isn't it mean to keep someone out? The question landed on the kind of moral theorizing that makes adults flinch. My daughter answered without theater, it's only mean if what you're keeping out is the person. It's not mean when you're keeping out the behavior that hurts us. That distinction, keeping out the behavior, became a household motto. It was not taught in a lecture, it was modeled at the table. We arranged chairs so people could sit without reopening old wounds. We said, not here at the table and not now at the doorway. Those small enactments mattered more than any abstract ethic. They taught a child how to hold affection while refusing endangerment at once. At a historical moment when talk about boundaries was finding new language. Self-help books proliferating, early conversations about toxic relationships. Our family turned those ideas into daily mechanics from that autumn. Forward, the practice became chronological, a sequence of choices repeated and honed the following year. In the autumn of 2004, came a particular test. The funeral of an uncle. On a drizzly October afternoon, funerals strip away the armor of planned civility. Grief dissolves prepared rules. People arrive with unresolved histories and raw need. And the assembly becomes a field where old resentments and small mercies compete for space. Relatives came in waves, some had not spoken in years, some arrived with apologies rehearsed to a crisp finish. At that funeral, my sister came with flowers and a quiet apology delivered without fanfare. The estranged woman who had sent that fraught note at the wedding. She came too, but not toward a reconciliation staged before the altar. They did not sit together, there was no theatrical showdown. Instead, a choreography of restraint unfolded, a nod across a coffee tray, a measured avoidance of the nave, the deliberate timing of sugar and cream. Their bodies were contiguous but unentangled. For me, that small containment was proof that permission had been taught at the wedding and had been internalized. It proved we could see people as whole and complicated, and still protect ourselves from their injurious parts. Those small, repeated rituals, the formation of what we came to call household grammar, were not invented in a vacuum. The wider world pressed in on us and gave shape to what we did. Between 2004 and 2008, society accelerated. Social media matured from tentative connections into platforms that reshaped friendship. The first iPhone arrived in 2007 and began the slow remaking of private life. And the tremors of the economy that would swell into a crisis in 2008 were already stirring in that noisy public period hour. Household practices proved unexpectedly resilient precisely because they were modest and repeated. We did not memorialize them in grand terms. We built small architectural supports. We established routines with precision that made them durable. A monthly morning coffee, an hour of short, purposeful exchange, became a fixture. Birthdays were observed by simple suppers governed by one rule: one toast per person. And no reliving the past. We choreographed exits so that someone would walk a guest to the car when needed, reserving a room for an invited guest who needed quiet. These were not gestures of magnanimity, they were the ordinary mechanics of safety, like sweeping a hearth or boiling an extra pot of tea. Smallness made them durable. The household grammar spilled outward. My daughter carried those practices into her social life at a company party for her husband in the mid-2000s, where corporate gatherings still followed older scripts. An uncle began to tell a story that risked reviving harm. Instead of confronting him into theatrical accusation, she intervened with redirection. She asked for a song and guided a friend to the piano. An off-key rendition of Happy Birthday dissolved tension. Laughter covered the moment, and the uncle flushed crimson and stopped. That intervention was not avoidance, it was a public art of diffusing scenes so they might be repaired later. If repair were possible, it was also a new etiquette. Privilege reparable futures over immediate moral victory, not all. Mitigation was improvisational social alchemy. Sometimes structural responses were required years later, after a cousin, long known as the drunken joker in family law, came uninvited one afternoon and demanded access to property while making a disturbance. We wrote a letter. The letter was bureaucratic and unsentimental. It read like a small contract outlining acceptable behaviors and the consequences for transgressions. Visits would be allowed only under specified circumstances. Intoxication would be forbidden. Public meetings would be encouraged when sober. On paper the stipulations sounded cold. In practice, they made access predictable and boundaries enforceable. The legal and cultural climate of the 2000s and early 2010s shaped how viable those contracts became. Family law in many places began to recognize that informal arrangements often failed to protect vulnerable people. Courts started to enforce restraining orders more regularly and to pay attention to patterns of coercive control. Simultaneously, the growth of electronic communication made agreements easier to document and harder to ignore. Letters could be emailed, prints kept. They became tangible artifacts in a rapidly digitizing world. Some relatives murmured that lists belonged to strangers. Others defended them as seatbelts rather than cudgels. I preferred the scaffolding when repeated histories show that better intentions buckle under temptation. External structure becomes fair. These contracts were not substitutes for trust. They were supports for people who had not learned to sustain change in private. We had failures. One woman who once had been close returned repeatedly to modes that hurt despite grand declarations of change. She could speak the right words and apologize with the voice of revelation. She could behave well for a time, then slip back into manipulative habits. After cycles of promise and disappointment, we sought a distance that allowed possibility without sacrificing safety. We wrote plainly, "We miss you, we cannot be around you. When you are like this," that phrase, lean and uncompromising, left a crack open in the door rather than a wide portal. It was a boundary with kindness built into its grammar. An allowance for return predicated on demonstrated change. Life did not pause while we negotiated these lines. The years that followed brought the usual procession of small domestic demands and the broader social shifts that reframed family life. After 2008, our parents aged and medical appointments multiplied. Toddlers developed picky eating habits. An elderly aunt's garden needed tending. A neighbor lost the use of her car and had to relearn asking for help. Civic obligations are where character is formed rather than merely revealed. My sister volunteered at the children's library on Thursdays. The estranged woman, despite her faults, also offered to read to kids on Thursdays. They did not coordinate. Their separate contributions did not force reconciliation. They created overlapping arcs of usefulness that made the neighborhood smaller, and kinder people could be useful without becoming mirrors of one another. Assistance did not demand a return to old intimate maps that had permitted harm. My father taught a parable that became a practical lesson in our house. He favored parables that were unsentimental. The story he liked was simple. A man coaxed a trapped frog back to water, and the frog, after floundering, settled into new habits. The frog was not a different species. Its relationship to its element changed, and so did everything around it. For my father, small acts mattered more than proclamations. He fixed chairs, opened jars, taught practical tricks to anyone willing to watch. His apologies were not pronounced from platforms. They were stitches in the fabric of ordinary life, mending seams, taking out the trash, making gentle corrections. The shape of his life taught maintenance as Moral practice. By the late 2000s our daughter became a mother. Sometime around 2007 or 2008, years threaded through the public history of smartphones arriving and financial crisis looming, toddlers introduced an immediate, crystalline test of what we had been teaching little children: do not care about the complexities of adult history. They want cookies and laps and the clarity of rules. Watching my daughter teach a child to say stop with warmth and firmness was one of the clearest proofs that something useful had been transmitted. She taught hands gentle, and the toddler learned because the rule always came with affection. Saying stop became both a right and a responsibility in the household lexicon. The economic crisis of 2008 altered family life in tangible ways. Jobs contracted, elder care needs rose, and the word community returned from an abstract ideal to a practical necessity. Our architectures, rules for gatherings, rehearsed exit plans, simple contracts, proved even more important during scarcity. Predictability is a kind of capital when money is low and tempers fray. In the early 2010s our practice continued to harden into habit. We limited the length of gatherings, specified rooms where certain conversations were off limits, and rehearsed modes of exit so that no one had to be brave beyond their resources in the moment. Those protocols reduced improvisation and spared people the emotional labor of inventing courage on the spot. Bravery, we found, is a scarce currency. Clarity and convenience are more reliable. We asked for action rather than declamation. When someone sought reintegration, we requested specific, measurable acts: a thoughtful letter, consistent volunteer hours at the library, repair work on the house. Attendance at community events without fanfare. Action became the currency of repair. A sustained volunteer commitment was worth more than an eloquent apology delivered in high emotion. We were not punitive. We merely required visible evidence that a person would participate in the world differently. Some measures worked splendidly. Years after the drunken incident that produced the letter contract, a postcard arrived from the cousin. He had moved west, been sober for a year, and was apprenticing with a carpenter. He enclosed a careful drawing of the stool he was learning to make. Plain, meticulous lines of legs and joints suggesting someone learning the habit of measure and patience. I replied with encouragement and sent a set of used chisels, tools already worn by work. It was not an invitation to forget, it was a tool for the craft he professed to want. The exchange was modest and utilitarian. Proof, in action, that we saw effort and valued it. Neighborly accountability sometimes changed behavior. A neighbor prone to disturbances began showing up at the community garden on Saturday mornings to plant beans. The accountability of a shared plot made selfishness harder to sustain. Small communal responsibilities placed limits on liberty in a way that reframed habit. Other attempts failed. Someone might engage for a season and fall away when novelty faded. We learned to scale responses, to accept partial successes, and to celebrate minutes of grace rather than wholesale transformations. Legal steps were taken when social norms were not enough, where property, guardianship, and safety were at stake. We drafted written agreements specifying times, conditions, and remedies for breach. Those documents were unromantic but effective. One cousin's uninvited demand for access had ended in a formal understanding. Certain visiting hours, sober accompaniment required, immediate removal from the premises if the terms were violated. These documents, plain in language, were anchored in the same household ethic since the wedding: dignity, protection, and open conditions for re-entry. And so boundaries became arrangements, conditional and reshaped by behavior. They were not moral verdicts on a person's whole life. We kept doors ajar for those making sustained, genuine efforts. Memory was treated as a map of caution, not a weapon to bludgeon with. We gave people a route back but not a free pass. One long winter in the early 2010s, nights bracing and long, an old friend slipped back into manipulative habits she had once been. Luminous decline began not in malice but in trouble and loneliness. For a time she appeared steady, reading to children at the library, showing up for coffee. But under stress she reverted to triangulation and guilt inducement. After patient attempts at repair we wrote again: "We miss you, we cannot be around you when you are like this." The words remained the same and the door stayed ajar, not closed in moral finality, but closed in protection. On quieter afternoons, with sunlight slanting through curtains and a loaf of bread baking on the counter, I thought about what our choices cost and what they gave. Some called our prudence cold, some relatives thought we were too strict, others welcomed our clarity. Our home, once an arena where every event became an exam of old history, grew more predictable and safe. Predictability is its own mercy. It lets children stumble without catastrophe and gives people in recovery a context to progress without temptation. At every turn we taught children to articulate boundaries in language of care. They learned verbs we used: gentle hands, stop, no, not now. They learned to say, I don't like that, instead of blaming, To explain it hurts me when you, instead of accusing these linguistic tools, operate like technologies for living with imperfect human beings. They prevented many scenes from escalating into ruptures as social media and instantaneous communication broadened children's vocabulary for privacy and consent. We tried to bridge generational gaps by keeping our household terms legible, and simple tiny acts of tenderness arrived unannounced. A neighbor dropping off a meal after surgery, a bouquet left on a doorstep with no signature, a teenager returning a borrowed bicycle without drama, understated and cumulative. These acts build the climate of ordinary kindness. They are the scaffolding that sustains the more fraught parts of life. The young rose in our living room after my mother's 90th in the spring of 2012 was one small index of that weather. Petals faded and composted. But the gesture mattered. We learned to savor small changes without overstating them. A postcard announcing a sober year is not a cure-all. A presence at a funeral does not erase previous harms. Yet these things, incremental and quiet, are signs. The cumulative effect of small, steady acts altered how history was inhabited. A patched chair changes the way people sit at a table. A repaired pot changes whether families can share soup without the friction of annoyance. The particularity of repair had thus become literal and ethical. We taught by example. When my daughter intervened with a song at that awkward party, she modeled redirection not as avoidance but as a transferable technique. She taught her children, patiently and playfully. If someone takes your toy, say, "I need a turn." And they learned that not every small injustice required battle. The lesson was to address acts rather than adjudicate whole personalities. Distinguishing behavior from being became the crucial ethical move. Not a metaphysical split but a pragmatic way to respond to harm without annihilating the whole person. Household customs emerged to make these practices second nature. If conversation began to circle old cruelties, someone would pick up a pot and begin washing. Busyness often redirected without humiliation. If someone at a gathering seemed overwhelmed, another would suggest a walk. Stepping away for air ceased to be treacherous. It became care. Normalizing absence as non-punitive lowered the stakes of each interaction. When stakes fall, people breathe. We resisted the ideological pressure to forgive unconditionally. In our practice, forgiveness was procedural. It required explanation, evidence over time, and conditions for reintegration. We did not demand theatrical penance. We asked for steady, concrete repair. Regular presence at the library, fence fixing, being on time for appointments. Action, repeated and ordinary, was what rebuilt trust. That trust, we discovered, is not binary. It behaves like a variable. A thermostat adjusted in small increments. We raised it with proof and lowered it with betrayals. Calibrating trust meant protecting it. Lowering the temperature when weather threatened, raising it as steady proof accumulated. There were legal documents where required, guardianship motions, visitation agreements that demanded sober accompaniment when behavior threatened children or property. The language was plain when a term was breached. Prearranged remedies were applied. Immediate removal, mediation, temporary exclusion. These measures stopped frantic improvisation. In moments when poor decisions were most likely, we tolerated small stumbles. An apology under stress, a lapse explained and not repeated. For repeated cycles we invested in structure, letters, volunteer commitments, mediated conversations. If someone returned after months or years of steady, unremarkable work, showing up at the library, fixing a fence, keeping appointments, we opened a small window for deeper engagement. The chisels we had sent were not merely symbolic, they asked to be used. A long arc of small gestures and measures produced modest but telling results. A neighbor who had once caused disturbances began to show up at the community garden. The accountability of a shared plot created a context that made selfishness harder to sustain. In other cases, measures failed and people fell away. When the novelty of change faded, we scaled our responses to fit the evidence and accepted partial successes. We celebrated minutes of grace, a day without a blow-up, a week of steady attendance. A month of sober mornings. Small wins accumulated, altered the shape of our shared life. There were also moments of quiet tenderness that arrived unannounced. A meal left after surgery, an anonymous bouquet, a teenager returning a bike. These acts stack. They make returning and repair possible. Without coercion, they create a cultural weather conducive to restoration. We taught children to see boundaries as instruments of care. No could be kind when aimed to keep someone safe. I need a turn could diffuse conflict. Saying stop became a right and a way to respect another. Language was a small technology that stopped many scenes before they ruptured as the years advanced. Weddings, funerals, retirements, birthdays, the slow passage that composes adult life. We continued to choose small architectures, where someone might sit, when they might visit. What behavior we asked for. The practice is not guaranteed to produce miracles. It is a discipline. Mercy and vigilance together form scaffolding for a fragile, precious enterprise. A life shared with people who have histories of tenderness and harm. In the mid-2010s, my father's last visits distilled the ordinary into the essential. He shuffled with a cane across the lawn, watching a child chase a leaf. He pointed at the child and at the house. No sermon, only the reminder of the frog story and the daily repairs he had made. He wanted no grand memorial. He wanted attention to small things. When he left the world, it felt like the silence after a long patient lesson. A teacher who had shown more than preached. Across the decade from 2003 through the middle years of the 2010s, repetition hardened our choices into habit. Grant dignity but withhold access to old harms. Insist on visible acts of repair. Make forgiveness conditional on proof of change. Keep the household functioning through habitual acts of care. It was not heroic or dramatic. It was the method by which a house with a messy history could continue to function. We learned to bend toward one another, without bowing so low that anyone was crushed. We learned to heal in increments, and to stop waiting for miracles. In the late 2010s, a small scene distilled what we had learned. Someone who had been estranged for years left a bouquet at our back gate. A quiet, heavy gesture. No note. When we called to ask whether they wanted to come in, they declined. Their voice sounded like someone who had rearranged their life. The bouquet sat by the door for a week. We watered the blooms. They became a small emblem of potentiality. Not demanded, not denied. An acted hope held in suspension. In that same decade, public conversations about consent and boundaries grew louder. Movements and legal cases brought private harms into public view, yet our household had been quietly practicing those distinctions for years. We taught our children to write letters that were clear and economical. We did not waste ink. No was spelled plainly when it was the case. If not in the house, perhaps a park for coffee. An alternative gesture that let people be near without granting private access. Invitations were specific, exceptions were rare. Consequences for breach were straightforward. People prefer clarity even when the news is austere. Predictability reduces wear on spirits. As the next generation matured into teenagers and then young parents, they carried the practice outward. They taught friends to speak plainly about boundaries and to refuse to be drawn into cycles of blame without a route to repair. The language of not here and not now became part of their rhetoric. They were neither saints nor cynics, only practical souls who demanded evidence for re-entry while allowing for mercy if warranted. Trust is adjustable. We increased it in small increments, decreased it when behavior warranted. Calibrating trust means protecting it, oscillating in response to weather and evidence. We learned to value predictable, boring steadiness over dramatic catharses. There were practical, enforceable rules that made kindness operational. Limits on length of gatherings, specified rooms where certain conversations were off limits. Rehearsed exits so that no single person had to invent moral courage in the middle of crisis. These protocols lightened the burden of decision and gave people simple scripts to follow. Rehearsal made protection ordinary. Sometimes the measures worked magnificently. A neighbor who had caused disturbances devoted Saturday mornings to the community garden. Accountability reformed him in small, visible ways. Other measures failed. We scaled responses and accepted partial successes. We celebrated minutes of grace. A day without a blow-up, a week of attendance, a month of sober mornings. Small victories, compounded, changed the direction of family life. There were also legal safeguards in place when collegial measures fell short. Guardianship, visitation terms specifying sober accompaniment, immediate remedies for breaches. These instruments were unromantic but stabilizing. They prevented frantic improvisation when poor decisions were most likely. When I look back on all of it, on the permutations of mercy and caution, it is the ordinary images that recur. A pot left to simmer while a difficult conversation takes place. A child's small hand pressing into an adult's palm to feel steadiness. A letter folded and posted with care. If anything grand was achieved by that wedding in the autumn of 2003, it was the choice to prioritize the small acts that keep a household standing. The practice is simple to describe and hard to live. Grant dignity. Withhold access to old harms. Insist on concrete acts of repair. Make forgiveness conditional on proof of change. Keep the house functioning through habitual, ordinary acts of care. Mercy and vigilance must be braided. Mercy without vigilance is reckless. Vigilance without mercy is brittle. Together they create a sturdier way to share life with imperfect people. My father used to say, without sermonizing, fix the leak now and avoid a storm later. The wedding forced us to fix a hole we had been avoiding. It did not erase the ledger of injuries, but it gave us tools and language to reduce harm and promote care. It taught us how to keep soup warm without making every gathering an inventory of moral history. If someone asks whether people change, I refuse certainty. What I can certify is the arithmetic of daily life. Incremental shifts so subtle a casual observer will miss them, yet significant enough to ripple through families. A sister's attendance at a funeral does not erase her cruelties. A cousin's sober year is not wholesale absolution, but patterns shift. The shifts are not strokes of lightning, They are the steady work of ordinary days we made categories. Welcome here but not there. Public gatherings allowed. Private spaces reserved for those who earned. Trust. Apologies appreciated but not automatic keys to access. Gifts given without being traded for intimacy. When said flatly, these categories can sound pragmatic or cold. In practice they were humane. Soft. Preserving what was dear without denying the need to keep people safe. We rehearsed responses. Not here when a conversation veered toward reliving injury. Not now when a gathering threatened to become a private reckoning. We appointed callers to step in and escort someone out, or arranged that a neighbor could take a person for a walk if a scene heated. Rehearsal made bravery less necessary in the moment. It made protection ordinary. Sometimes the measures produced small wonders. A neighbor's accountability at the garden changed a long-standing pattern. Other attempts failed. We adapted. Scaled, celebrated partial victories. We learned patience and humility. To accept repair as a process rather than a one-off miracle. There were also small, quiet acts of tenderness that mattered more than ostentation. An unexpected meal, a bouquet on the doorstep, a teenager returning a borrowed bike. These deeds accumulate into a weather of ordinary kindness. They make space for return without coercion. We taught children to see boundaries as care instruments. No, could be kind when aimed to keep someone safe. I need a turn could diffuse conflict. Saying stop became a right and a way to respect another language. As technology prevented scenes before they ruptured. As the years progressed, weddings, funerals, retirements, birthdays, we continued to choose small architectures. The work was not about guarantee but discipline. Mercy braided with vigilance. A life shared with imperfect people needs scaffolding. It needs predictable scripts, rehearsed exits, clear terms for re-entry. It needs a house that holds both tenderness and caution. If you find someone at the edge of a garden holding a bouquet without a note, water the flowers. Let them be a quiet testament to what might be possible without forcing it. Live by small permissions. Hold memory as a map of caution rather than a bludgeon. Allow mercy to be earned through ordinary acts. Keep the door ajar when you can, closed when you must. Keep the soup warm. Place the chairs where people can sit. Say what you mean, and mean what keeps people safe. There is no tidy end to these practices. The calendar keeps turning. Political headlines move on. Technology shift how relatives reach each other. What once could be a face-to-face reconciliation attempt can now be a string of messages and screenshots. New cultural conversations will supply new vocabularies for harm and repair. Restorative justice programs, trauma-informed schooling, public campaigns about consent and coercion. Yet the lessons we learned remain practical and stubborn. Draw lines, keep agreements, demand acts, not only words, and remember that kindness is daily craft. Everything returns. Finally, to that evening in September 2003. It was not a climactic court decision or a public verdict. It was a small, domestic refusal in a living room lit by the indecisive early fall light. It was a boundary that protected and preserved possibility. It was the beginning of a long, patient discipline. A house learning to safeguard its young and its weak while allowing people to be present in the parts of themselves that did no harm. If this seems prudential rather than romantic, so be it. The arc of the years since has taught me that prudence, braided with mercy, can keep a family whole enough to house tenderness. If the wedding in September 2003 was the moment when a household quietly set a new norm, the subsequent years were its laboratory. The practice spread outward in ways both ordinary and surprising. In 2004 we painted the nursery twice. Once a pale green after a late-night argument, and again a few months later when a child's crescendos of laughter made the color seem inadequate. In 2007 a cousin learned to call first. In 2010 we signed powers of attorney and a simple will, not because calamity loomed but because planning reduces improvisation. Each paper, each small legal step, felt less like cold insurance and more like a scaffolding for the ordinary mercies of daily life. Public events made our private language legible to more people. The hashtag movements that rose in the mid and late 2010s, hashtag #MeToo in 2017 among them, gave words to many private experiences. The legal cases and media inquiries of those years shifted what had once been whispered into something discussed aloud in living rooms and school PTA meetings. We found our household vocabulary reflected in these public conversations. Consent, boundaries, accountability, and restorative practice that made some things easier when the language was shared. Younger relatives could cite it in moments of tension, and their elders could sometimes see their choices reflected back in a broader moral conversation. The late 2010s also brought a change in technology that altered the mechanics of boundary keeping. Between 2010 and 2018 cell phones and social platforms became primary sites for reconciliation attempts, and their failures. Where once someone came to the door to ask for forgiveness, they were now likely to send a string of messages at midnight. Where once an apology arrived folded on a page, it arrived as a sequence of read receipt screens made avoidance easier and intrusion more persistent. Screenshots became a strange new currency of accountability. A written promise, once private, could be made public in an instant, so we adapted. Requests for meetings were made by curated messages, and conditions for in-person contact were laid down in black and white emails. If you want to talk in person, set a public place, bring no alcohol, and tell us what you intend to discuss beforehand, became an ordinary line in correspondence. It was workaday, but again the point was not romance. It was clarity. By 2016 and 2017 our children, those who had been small at that 2003 wedding, were themselves finding partners, giving birth, and confronting the same naughty mix of history and desire. They had learned to say no, not as a denial of love but as a protection of the self, and they used the formal language we had taught them when negotiating. Their own guest lists, custody exchanges, and caregiving arrangements. The oldest, who had been 8 at the time of our wedding, became a parent in 2015 and insisted on visitation schedules that mirrored the household's careful practice. The next, who had been 10, married in 2018 and ran a reception where exits were rehearsed and the playlist included soft instrumental music precisely to discourage old arguments from igniting. There were public milestones that tested those arrangements. Funerals are a kind of moral stress test. They compress resentment, grief, and the desire for belonging into a single day. When an aunt died in 2019, we faced the question of who would speak at the service and who would be allowed to attend the immediate family viewing because our family had long used routinized scripts. The answers were procedural rather than improvisational. Invitations specified whether the service was for immediate family only, whether the reception would be open, and whether those attending were expected to commit to a sobriety window. People respected the lines because they were clear, and because the lines had never been framed as punitive alone but as ways to ensure that grief could be shared without harming others. Then 2020 arrived and altered every ordinary assumption. The pandemic imposed boundary conditions of its own: 2-week quarantines, mask mandates, vaccine debates, and the sudden prevalence of virtual funerals for families like ours. The pandemic's public health rules intersected with our private rules. We had long rehearsed exits from heated rooms. Now we rehearsed hand washing, symptom checks, and the technology required for video calls. Video conference etiquette: mute when not speaking, cameras on during toasts, private chat for side conversations, became an extension of our home protocols. In March 2020, we cancelled a planned extended family reunion and instead arranged staggered drives-by greetings and a porch that served as staging area for distanced gifts. The sensation was familiar. Adapt or risk harm. What had once been moral prudence became literal protection against a virus. The pandemic also amplified the value of what we used to call small permissions. A neighbor bringing bread to the gate in April 2020 was not just kind but necessary. Garden spaces were suddenly prized as safe places for scaled-down gatherings. The bouquet left at the back gate in the late 2010s, remembered now as an emblem, found an echo in a dozen mask drop-offs in 2020. People learned again that presence could take many forms. Sometimes being present meant sending a recording of a child's recital rather than attending in person, or dropping a casserole on a stoop rather than entering a house. During 2020 and 2021, we also had to confront the proliferation of performative gestures, public apologies, viral declarations of reform, and the demand for instant accountability often skimmed the surface of repair without embedding it in daily habit. We watched relatives issue statements on social media and then revert to old behaviors. We learned to discriminate. Platformed remorse was not the same as visible, sustained change. Once more, the household's rule held: acts, not words. Reopen doors. Legal tools continued to be a reliable fallback. In 2021, we renewed guardianship documents for an elder who had cognitive decline. We added provisions for supervised visitation and a clause for immediate termination of privileges upon substance relapse. These instruments were clinical but stabilizing. They prevented improvisational harm when regulation was needed most. They also carried a moral freight. To put limitations into law is to recognize that love must sometimes be constrained to prevent harm. The era also produced stories of partial success. A brother-in-law, who had been dismissed from family affairs in 2005, maintained sobriety beginning in 2012 and kept to sober check-ins for a year before being invited to an out-of-house picnic in 2014. He did well for several years and was welcomed to a children's birthday in 2016 under the watchful soft arrangements we had established. Later relapses, humbling and heartbreaking, reminded us of the limits of singular triumphs. Recovery, like family repair, is non-linear and requires infrastructure. There were other instances of true slow change. A cousin who committed to counseling in 2017 and who by 2020 managed consistent attendance at family events in public spaces. These shifts were not triumphal arcs but weathered progress. The winds of civic discourse also affected younger kin in practical ways. Schools in the early 2020s began to implement trauma-informed practices. Restorative justice circles appeared in middle schools and community centers. Our grandchildren, those born after 2010, learned vocabulary earlier than we had. They could name consent, interruption protocols, and the consequences of breach. They were taught to see boundaries as instruments of care that meant that disagreements at Christmas tables sometimes concluded with an 8-year-old requesting a cool-down walk, a rehearsal we had pioneered long before but which was now taught in schools. Anniversaries kept the past alive as practice. In September 2023 we marked 20 years since that wedding in 2003. We did not convene an ostentatious party. We gathered in a staggered series of small outdoor dinners, each with explicit guest lists and protocols that would have once sounded bureaucratic but now felt like a kind of tenderness. We retold the story of the night the parents said, "Don't come home, your sister doesn't want you there," and how that refusal had been less punishment than protection. We told it not to celebrate exclusion but to explain a method that had, over 2 decades, kept the household whole enough to sustain joy. Deaths continued to test our practice. A close friend of the family died in 2022 from long-standing illness. The memorial was both in-person and live-streamed, allowing those who could not travel or who chose not to enter a closed room a way to participate. We devised seating charts keyed to comfort levels. A ring for the intimate, an outer ring for more distant relations. We made explicit that certain stories, old accusations and recriminations, were not to be part of the eulogies. Honoring someone, we had learned, need not mean reopening old wounds. By the mid-2020s political polarization and rapid news cycles forced another kind of boundary work. Debates in comment sections could spiral into family-level ruptures. We taught younger kin to avoid performative declarations about private matters in public forums. If it's family, talk privately, became again a household rule. If it was a matter of public policy in which one member had institutional responsibilities, then talking in public had its place. The distinction was nuanced and required repeated negotiation, but our children and grandchildren, schooled by both the household and public conversation, grasped it in the end. What the last 2 decades taught us is that stability is not static. It is procedural. The small rituals, letters posted, bouquets watered, rehearsed exits, sober accompaniment at certain events, became a grammar for living among people who carried one another's histories. Those rituals were never romantic. They were not meant to be. They were a set of tools for preserving the possibility of tenderness. We learned that mercy does not mean removing all consequence, nor does vigilance require perpetual suspicion. We learned to calibrate trust incrementally and to institutionalize kindness through predictable behaviors. New challenges will come. Technology will evolve again. The cultural lexicon will shift. New legal frameworks will appear. People will err and return in forms we cannot now imagine. There will be grandchildren who need us to explain why some doors remain closed and why others, creaking, can be opened. What I can say with the long, patient confidence that comes from living through small iterations, is that the habit of making kindness administrative, that is, of turning mercy into practice, has outlived any single headline or cultural moment. So we keep the chairs where people can sit, keep the soup warm, and keep the lines clear. We teach the next generations to value routine acts of care as moral technology. We keep funeral protocols and wedding rules, not for their own sake but because they protect the tender. We continue to water bouquets left at gates even when the person who left them asks never to return. Sometimes the flowers wilt, sometimes they bloom, and sometimes they become compost for the next season. We hold memory as a map of caution rather than a bludgeon, and we allow mercy to be earned slowly, in ordinary increments. The house endures, not because it is perfect, but because it has learned to make protection habitual and kindness operational, and we are still learning how best to do that in seasons yet to come. After we marked the 20th anniversary in September 2023, the next few years felt like a continuation of an experiment we had never meant to codify but whose results we depended on. 2024 opened with a modest, deliberate move toward formalization. We convened a family council in March 2024, nothing judicial, nothing theatrical. A single afternoon at the community center where the tables were arranged in a rectangle so no one had to sit at the head. The agenda was written weeks in advance. We set a few ground rules that echoed older practices and renamed others. We authorized a matrix of permissions for attendance at healthcare appointments and hospital rooms. We wrote down the sober accompaniment rule for any event in which alcohol might be served, and we created a map that linked names with the specific communications they would receive in the case of illness, hospitalization, or death. We put dates on the documents. Adopted March 3, 2024. The act of writing and dating those pages made the existing habits feel less ephemeral. The council was not unanimous, nor did it pretend unanimity. A cousin argued that letters and lists could never contain the tenderness of spontaneous forgiveness. Another sibling insisted that spontaneity had been the cause of most harm. A nephew, now a college sophomore, asked whether the rules meant someone could never come back. We answered with the story we had told before. The night of the wedding in 2003, the words our parents had spoken, and the way those words had been a protective refusal rather than a permanent decree. We explained the difference between exile and time-bound boundaries. We voted, we dated, and we photocopied. The copies were placed in a folder in the kitchen, next to the recipe cards and the list of emergency contacts. That folder was yet another ritual object. Between 2024 and 2026, the family was tested again by small, ordinary things that felt disproportionately consequential. In late 2024, the brother-in-law, who had first sustained a period of sobriety beginning in 2012, applied to be an informal caretaker for an ailing neighbor. He passed several background checks and kept a clean record for 18 months. Encouraged, he petitioned informally via a mediator we had agreed upon in 2024 for regular inclusion in a weekly Saturday lunch. Those lunches, scheduled in 2025, were held in a public garden pavilion rather than any of our houses. They were, in effect, probationary rights, meals with watchful but not scrutinizing company for many months. He arrived sober, helped carry trays, and left before dessert. In the spring of 2026, he relapsed. The relapse was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. We invoked the written protocols adopted in 2024 and shifted him back to a list of supervised contacts, and the community center that had hosted our council became a location where he completed a 6-week relapse prevention course. The pattern was familiar. It taught the family once more that institutional clarity did not erase the pain of relapse, but it did limit the damage. The courts intersected with domestic routines in ways we had anticipated. In January 2025, a distant aunt contested a guardianship clause for a great-uncle who had dementia. The suit was not malicious. It was an assertion of kinship and a contested view of what immediate family meant in an era when families were geographically dispersed. The hearing took place in April 2025. We presented the renewal of guardianship from 2021 and the mediation notes from March 2024. The judge acknowledged the family's pattern of procedural kindness and deferred to the guardianship so long as periodic reviews were scheduled every 6 months. The legal decision, dated April 18, 2025, became another inflection point. It reinforced that formal instruments can scaffold moral choices, but also that review is necessary when bodies and laws change. Technology continued to complicate boundaries in unexpected ways. Between 2025 and 2028, the family encountered innovations that outpaced habit. In 2025, a platform introduced memory threads that stitched public posts into a curated timeline. In 2026, a startup offered automated transcript summaries of family group chats. Privacy advocates advocated for design changes. Our family used the tools and discovered their affordances. We created an internal policy in November 2026. No automated cross-posting of private chats to public feeds. No AI-generated voices without prior consent from the person whose voice would be synthesized. The policy itself was a boundary. It recognized that technology could reproduce the past and thus had moral consequences for people still living. The generation born after 2010 grew up in a kitchen where policies and practice coexisted. By 2027, our eldest grandchild, born in 2011, was 16 and sat in a school advisory circle where students used pause cards to signal cooling off periods, a direct descendant of the cool-down walk we had taught years earlier. In April 2027, a middle school teacher from our town visited our house and asked if she could see the family charter she wanted to show students. An intergenerational example of boundary work. The photograph her students took, labeled Charter, circulated in a modest community newsletter that some of the kids felt proud and, unpredictably, so did those of us who remembered the nights when boundaries were folded into the margins of other arguments. Funerals remained the most exacting tests. In October 2027, my mother, who had been alive at the 2003 wedding and who had once said the famous words, fell ill with an infection that led to complications. The hospice team recommended a visitation protocol that felt, in form, very much like the ones we had rehearsed for decades. We created 3 concentric rings: immediate family, extended family by invitation, and a public livestream. We dated the notice October 12, 2027. We also included a procedural addendum about stories not to be used in the eulogy. A "we did this for the record" clause that some found awkward and others found merciful. In the end, the funeral doubled as a pedagogy. The youngest grandchildren observed how adults chose words and what was left unsaid. They saw the costume of ceremony chairs placed to honor proximity, a moderator who reminded speakers of the agreed constraints, and the live stream that allowed a cousin overseas to speak via video and then step away without lingering. Not every test bent toward the pragmatic. In 2028, a public controversy flared after a relative posted about a private family dispute in the context of national debates about accountability. The post received thousands of comments and drew strangers into the domestic drama. We responded collectively and swiftly, invoking the rule that if it's family, talk privately. On March 21, 2028, we issued a brief family statement, written not as a public airing but as a public boundary, a reminder that public platforms can amplify pain but rarely resolve it. The relative later apologized in private and agreed to a period of social media abstention. The abstention was not taken as penance but as a structural aid to repair. The year taught us that our practices could be exported to public life if we had the discipline. Legal and civic institutions also shifted in response to broader trends. In 2029, a county program emerged offering restorative family mediation subsidized by public funds for relatives dealing with caregiving disputes. We participated in one pilot in August 2029. The process was not magic. It was methodical. A facilitator from the county guided us through narratives, asked each person to state harms and desires, and then helped craft a written agreement with checkpoints. The resulting document bore the date of August 30, 2029 and signatures. These public resources complemented our private cartography of rules. They taught us that when civic infrastructure met family prudence, both improved. The course of reconciliation remained uneven. In November 2029, a younger sibling, who had been excluded in 2003, arrived at a Thanksgiving dinner with a typed letter and a proposal to enter a phased reconciliation. The letter was dated November 14, 2029, and contained a sequence of commitments: enrollment in counseling, routine drug screens, and a willingness to accept supervised visits with the grandchildren. The response was deliberative rather than emotional. We asked for a probationary year, a calendar of check-ins, and a mediator, plus the understanding that some privileges would remain withheld until trust was rebuilt. The year 2030 then became, for us, an experiment in low stakes reintegration. Throughout these years we continued to rely on small rituals as the backbone of practice. On cold mornings in January 2030, we still left soups and paper instructions about who could enter kitchens and who should be met at the gate. We still managed bouquets left at thresholds, sometimes by people who had asked never to return. We kept the practice of leaving a vase on stoops with a sticky note, "For what it's worth. Thanks for thinking of us." These acts were not merely sentimental. They were a language of accountability. In miniature, education remained one of the most generative arenas of change. By 2030, restorative justice circles had become regular in the high school. Our grandchildren attended a teacher who had led circles in 2022, now supervised a community intergenerational circle, and asked our family members to participate as models of long-duration boundary work. We brought copies of our 2024 charter and the November 2026 technology policy and showed students how practices accumulate. The students asked about the wedding in 2003. The night our parents said, "Don't come home, your sister doesn't want you there," and what that meant across decades. We explained that some damages require time to heal and that boundaries are not eternal exiles but calibrated gates. There were moments of grace too. In the summer of 2031, the nephew born in 1995, who had been 8 at the wedding in 2003 and who had become a parent in 2015, led a small ceremony in his backyard to celebrate his youngest child entering school. He incorporated a moment of acknowledgement for people who had kept to the protocols that made the children's lives safe. He read aloud portions of the charter and the family's written rule about sober accompaniment. Those passages had dates attached, and the reading lent them the air of family scripture, parchment of the mundane, not the miraculous. We also learned to say no publicly and kindly. In 2032, a cousin asked to be included in our annual winter gathering, a day that had become smaller and more intentional since 2020. The cousin had a history of unpredictability. We offered alternatives: a meetup at a coffee shop with a friend as mediator, attendance at a public library program, a video call with time limits. The cousin accepted a coffee arrangement and an agreement to attend a church service but declined the kitchen invitation. We dated the exchange in our logbook. Correspondence, December 22, 2032. The refusal was not punishment. It was a configured safety as the years folded in on themselves. We kept returning to a central lesson learned from the long arc that began with that wedding in 2003. Time reframes the terms of sign and remedy. Boundaries that once felt like brittle barricades acquire texture. A closed door that is gradually opened under witness teaches different lessons than a door opened suddenly in the absence of record. The family archive, a modest set of dated notes, guardianship renewals, mediation summaries, and technology policies. became an apparatus for memory. It was indexed not in a library but in a kitchen drawer. Yet its presence mattered. We do not pretend to have solved the problem of how to begin in a world that is fast and porous. There will be new platforms that encourage spectacle, new legal forms, and new illnesses that will test the elasticity of our care. People will err, return, recede, and sometimes leave forever, but because we have threaded our acts across years, given dates to them, and learned to translate mercy into routine, the family is more able to bear those vicissitudes. We continue to keep chairs, to leave soup warm, to water bouquets at gates, to file documents with dates, and to teach the next generation how to make tenderness procedural, all the while moving toward further reckonings that we will meet with the same deliberate patience we kept at it. Between 2033 and 2038 the record grew denser, not because anything dramatic happened at once, but because the ordinary accretion of dated acts is itself a kind of history. On March 5, 2033 we held a kitchen table meeting to revise the 2024 Charter in light of new realities. Bank apps that archived family payments, school portals that stored attendance notes, and a neighbor who had begun using community sensors to manage deliveries. The revision was modest in prose but consequential in practice. It added a clause, dated March 5, 2033, that any new digital service used by the family should be reviewed for privacy implications before shared credentials were exchanged. It also required an annual audit of access permissions, to be performed by a rotating member of the adult household. We signed and dated the amendment and put it into the drawer with the other documents that spring. On May 21, 2033, our eldest grandchild, the one born in 2011 who had sat in advisory circles in 2027, graduated from a regional arts program. She had been 16 in April 2027, and by May 2033 she was 22. The continuity of her life against the family's long timeline felt like proof that rules carried forward. The graduation was small: a civic hall, a string quartet composed of classmates, and a communal potluck held outside. We used the event to test a new host covenant, a one-page agreement dated May 21, 2033 that set expectations for hospitality. When people with fragile histories were present, the covenant required an appointed host to greet any arrival, to offer quiet spaces, and to circulate the same language we had used for years. If it's family, talk privately. The covenant allowed us to live out the principle in a way that guests could read and understand immediately. Technology kept arriving, and with it came new legal and ethical inflection points. In late 2034 several platforms began to offer posthumous profiles, aggregations that allowed a deceased person's public posts, their public-facing photos, and select messages to remain active and interact through AI-driven replies. The practice felt to many like a grim echo of the memory threads that had launched in 2025, but with a qualitative leap. These profiles could post on behalf of the absent. On June 7, 2034 the county released a guideline for families titled Managing Digital Afterlives. And we registered as a pilot household. The county's guideline reinforced what we had learned at hospice, ceremony and consent matter in our participation. We drafted a short addendum, dated June 14, 2034, specifying that no posthumous profile would be created for any family member without a signed declaration made while they were alive, and that any memorialization would be managed by a designated memory trustee. The addendum joined our archive. The restrictions seemed to be working until March 2035, when a violation forced us to test enforcement in public. On March 14, 2035, an alumnus of a small media company republished a series of clips from our mother's public talks, clips that had been in circulation since the 1990s, and used them as training data to synthesize a public voice that continued to answer comments in the platform's memorial spaces. The output was uncanny: familiar cadences, a laugh at a certain point, and sentences that suggested knowledge she did not possess. After 2027, we were shocked and unsettled. Our November 2026 policy had anticipated many of these problems by forbidding AI-generated voices without prior consent, but the synthesized voice had been constructed from material that was technically public. We filed a complaint with the platform on March 14, 2035, and followed with a public statement on March 20, 2035 explaining why the practice felt like a theft. The platform removed the synthesized replies on April 1, 2035, and on April 20, 2035, amended its memorial tools to require documented consent for any generative representation. We inserted a dated erratum into our file, April 25, 2035, acknowledging that public material could be repurposed by others and that our defenses needed to be both legal and cultural. The matter produced more than relief. it generated an opportunity. In the summer of 2035, our family accepted an invitation to serve on a county advisory council drafting consent-first templates for memorial tools. The council published its recommendations in a report dated September 12, 2035. We were careful to emphasize the administrative tone we had learned to respect. Consent, we insisted, should be embedded in forms that were easy enough for ordinary people to use and yet rigid enough to be enforced by platforms and courts. The council's work accelerated the municipal program that had begun in 2029. By 2036, similar templates were adopted in neighboring counties. The public turned toward design as a site of moral labor. Meanwhile, the civic program that had offered restorative family mediation in 2029 matured. On May 12, 2036, members of our family completed a county-run certification to serve as community mediators. The curriculum had been updated since our 2029 pilot. It now included modules on digital harms, on the special dynamics of multigenerational households, and on how to translate private charters into community templates. We finished training and received certificates dated May 12, 2036. We then volunteered to run a pilot circle at the high school where our grandchildren attended. An echo of the teacher who had come to our house in April 2027 seeking the charter. The circle we led in November 2036 drew both skepticism and gratitude. Teenagers asked hard questions about justice and reparation. Adults offered stories with dates. The exercise taught us how much public pedagogy can borrow from private rigor. Reintegration, too, continued to be a long and irregular process. The younger sibling who had been excluded in 2003 and who had submitted the November 14, 2029 letter remained in a provisional status for years. The probationary year we asked for in 2029 and experimented with in 2030 had not resolved everything. Trust is not a year-long product but an accumulation over the next decade. The sibling kept appointments, attended counseling sessions, and submitted to the random drug screenings that were part of the agreement. Progress was non-linear. On August 30, 2029 we had signed a mediation document. On November 14, 2029 the letter arrived. On November 14, 2032 we documented a relapse and recalibrated supports. It was only on June 15, 2037 that we convened what we called a privilege review. A formal meeting with a mediator present and a signed addendum to the original agreement that allowed the sibling to attend a family graduation dinner without a formal chaperone. The review bore the date June 15, 2037. The dinner was guarded but ordinary. There were hugs that lasted longer than we expected and a few small silences that felt like test results. The privilege review did not restore the past. It recognized the possibility of future service. Rituals adapted as well. The soups that had been left on cold mornings in January 2030 persisted into later winters. On January 6, 2038 we found a bowl of vegetable soup on the stoop with a sticky note, "For the house. Warm for whoever needs it." We dated the find and photographed it for the family log. The child's handwriting on the note matched a grandchild who had been taught to prepare broth as a first kitchen task in 2029. These small, tactile acts continued to translate policy into care. Ceremony acquired a new adjunct in 2037 and 2038. The library of oral histories we had begun compiling in 2029 was finally indexed and accessible in a modest online repository. The repository carried a seal and a use policy dated October 1, 2037. We transcribed interviews, added dates to recollections, and annotated narratives with the context of related events. Mediation dates, hospital stays, and charters. The archive was not a tidy record of triumph. It documented absences as much as presence. Still, it made possible a different kind of learning. Students used it in 2038 for local history modules, and counselors used selected segments in restorative circles to help people hear the tonalities of remorse and resolve. Not all endings were gradual. On February 14, 2038, a former cousin who had been estranged for years died unexpectedly. The death occasioned a delicate set of choices. The family had to decide who could speak, what stories might be told, and whether the cremation memorial would be public. We consulted the 2024 Charter, the March 5, 2033 Amendment, and our county's Managing Digital Afterlives guidance from June 7, 2034. We held a meeting on February 19, 2038, a day when the calendar's dates felt like anchors. The eventual arrangement, small in-person attendance with a public live reading of a pre-arranged statement, was dated February 22, 2038. In the log, the choice honored the need for closure while maintaining protection against spectacle. The years were also pedagogical for the youngest generation. In the autumn of 2038, the middle school that had once borrowed our charter from the photograph asked us to run a day-long workshop on boundary grammar. We arrived on October 3, 2038 with printed copies of the dated Documents: the November 2026 Technology Policy, the August 30th, 2029 Mediation Summary, the April 25th, 2035 Erratum, and a packet that explained how to file a complaint with a platform. Teenagers paired up and practiced saying no without rancor. They drafted family statements and dated them. We watched and realized that what seemed like our private bureaucracy had become a civic literacy kit through all these small public acts. The phrase that had once rippled through our lives, "Don't come home. Your sister doesn't want you there," remained a specter, not as a line to be repeated but as a geography to be understood. The phrase was not a scripture to be invoked as punishment. It was a coordinate on a map of harm and responsibility. We noticed that the younger people in the family, when asked about the 2003 wedding, rarely repeated the words verbatim. Instead, they asked about the processes that followed. What documents were created, who mediated, and how long did it take to test a return? Their curiosity was procedural rather than punitive. By 2039, a different pattern had emerged. Families in our neighborhood began to pre-flight major gatherings with a short checklist and a dated exchange that clarified expectations. Who would speak, what topics were off-limits, and what technology could be used. The practice was practical and, some said, antiseptic. We maintained, however, that it was also a form of tenderness, because it allowed people to show up without the terror of misstep. Our logbook for 2039 is filled with such little exchanges. Notes about supervised visits, dated receipts for mediation payments, records of soup deliveries, and the occasional acknowledgement of someone whose boundary work had been steady over decades. The guardianship that had been renewed in 2025 continued to operate under its 6-month reviews. The review cycle produced small, regular rituals, medical updates, legal filings, and family meetings. On April 18, 2025, the guardianship had been renewed as a formal scaffold for moral choices. By 2040, that scaffolding would likely need adaptation. We knew that bodies change, that laws change, and that technologies will keep inventing new ways to trouble the past. Our practice, therefore, remained one of dated decisions and documentary humility. We did not pretend to have finished anything. In the spring of 2040, a cousin, who had once caused a public uproar in 2028, asked to engage in a restorative sequence that would be mediated by the state network. We placed the request in the log on March 2, 2040, and scheduled a preliminary intake for March 15, 2040. The work ahead will require more of the same: patience, formal agreements, and an insistence on making reparative acts visible and dated. The family has learned to convert effect into procedure without losing warmth, to treat technology as both tool and risk, and to teach an ethic of care that is legible across generations. We will continue to keep chairs, to leave soup warm, to water bouquets at gates, to file documents with dates, and to teach the next generation how to make tenderness procedural as we confront further reckonings together. We began the intake on March 15, 2040, precisely as recorded in the log. A preliminary questionnaire, a short statement of harms, and a request for outcomes were filed in the presence of a state network intake officer who logged the session at 10:15 a.m. The cousin's petition, entered under the case number we kept in the family register, referred to the public uproar of 2028 and to the months of estrangement that followed. The intake form required us to attach the charter and its amendments. We appended the 2024 charter, the March 5, 2033 amendment, the August 30, 2029 mediation summary, the April 25, 2035 erratum, and entries from the family log noting the sequence of events in 2003 and thereafter. The officer dated the packet March 15, 2040 and provided a preliminary schedule: 7 mediated sessions, 3 community testimony evenings, and a final privilege review to be arranged no sooner than 1 year after the initial agreement. The schedule was conservative. The state network's planners had learned, from our county's experiments, that haste tended to magnify resentment. Sessions began on April 23, 2040. We convened in the County Mediation Center, Room B, where our family and the cousins sat in a circle beneath a plaque recounting the council's September 12, 2035 recommendations. The presence of that plaque seemed almost ceremonial, an archival reminder that our household's private paperwork had become a template for civic labor. 4 mediators rotated the sessions. 2 bore certificates dated May 12, 2036. The same county certification our family had completed, and a third was a younger mediatrix who had helped pilot the high school circle in November 2036. The mediators insisted, at each meeting, on articulating dates. For each recounting of harm we recorded when the act occurred, when it was reported, and when it was mediated. The practice of dated speech shaped the conversations. It taught people to distinguish between immediate feeling and the slow work of accountability. The cousin asked for permission to speak publicly about the 2028 incident. The family, recalling the crisis in 2038 that had required us to choose who could speak at a cremation memorial, Treated this as a procedural question rather than a moral one. We consulted the archive repository policy, filed under the repository's seal and dated October 1, 2037, and the county's guidelines on public testimony on May 8, 2040. We wrote an addendum, dated and signed, granting the cousin a limited public statement to be read at a state-sponsored listening session on June 19, 2040. The addendum stipulated no unauthorized audio repurposing and required that any use of recorded voice be pre-approved in writing, a clause that drew its language from the consent first template we had helped draft in 2035. The cousin's path forward was not linear. On November 14, 2040, the date that had once seen the younger sibling's letter in 2029, we recorded a setback, a missed appointment and a call from the probation officer noting a lapse in the medication schedule. We dated the entry and adjusted supports, more frequent check-ins, an added counselor specializing in relapse prevention, and a community sponsor assigned by the county program. On February 3, 2041, the cousin completed a writing assignment for the circle, a dated apology that connected specific acts to their consequences, with a plan for reparation items that included volunteer hours at the soup project and a pledge to participate in 2 public service sessions per quarter. The assignment was logged, transcribed, and archived with the repository. We assigned a use policy date, February 3, 2041, to the file and noted in the family ledger that the cousin had read the apology aloud in a closed circle on February 12, 2041. Work with the state network also pushed us to think beyond the family. County officials began, in early 2041, to circulate an updated municipal memo that incorporated elements from our 2035 council work and from the county's restorative sequences. On April 2, 2041, the memo, Guidance for Consent and Commemoration, was posted to 3 adjacent counties' portals and referenced our family's pilot materials and the council report of September 12, 2035. The memo advised municipalities to require dated consent for any post-mortem generative representation, to use simple forms that were subject to administrative audit, and to make archives of oral histories available under tiered use agreements. The memo bore a metadata note, adopted with reference to County Advisory Council, September 12, 2035. See Local Charters, 2024 to 2037. The language was bureaucratic but practical. Councillors praised its clarity at a regional meeting on May 16, 2041. Parallel to policy updates, technology evolved in ways that challenged our precautions. By mid-2041, synthesized audio became cheaper to produce and easier to paste into unsolicited commemorative artifacts. A consumer platform, in August 2041, published a feature that allowed users to collect a public figure's utterances and to bundle them into memorial montages. We recognized the risk. We had seen a version of it in 2035 when the platform repurposed public materials into an unauthorized voice. Our county had already strengthened platform agreements, but the proliferation of third-party tools required more durable legal guardrails. We responded, with other families and the County Advisory Group, by drafting a model ordinance that made false representation of a deceased person's voice actionable when done without express consent. Dated and recorded. The draft circulated on September 9, 2041, and the County Council held a public hearing on October 21, 2041, where our family read testimony dated October 21, 2041 about the earlier 2035 incident. The ordinance passed in a modified form on December 15, 2041, and was codified locally as the Afterlife Representation Statute, which required platforms to honor documented consent and to publish redress procedures. The statute referenced prior county guidance and the April 20, 2035 platform amendment as precedent. The archive continued to operate as a civic instrument. In March 2042, the repository accepted, under new licensing rules dated March 1, 2042, pedagogical modules that used select transcripts from our oral histories for 10th grade civics classes. The county school board adopted those modules on May 12, 2042, and scheduled them for rollout in the 2042 to 2043 academic year. Students learned to draft dated family agreements and to understand the mechanics of mediation rather than only the rhetoric of apology. Teachers reported back, on November 4, 2042, that students responded better to rule-based tenderness than to abstract platitudes. They could practice saying no coherently, and community teachers used the archive's annotated transcripts to teach tonal recognition and contextual disclosure. The cousins process was slow but measurable. On June 27, 2042, the state network recorded a milestone, completion of the 7th mediated session and a community testimony evening where the cousin answered questions from people who had been hurt. The evening was cautious. We logged it under June 27, 2042, and noted the presence of 2 elder witnesses who had been at the 2003 wedding and who could attest, by date and detail, to prior harms the cousin accepted. Constraints: no unsupervised social media discussions for 6 months, a probationary limit on attendance at large family events until a future privilege review, and an obligation to perform 30 documented hours of service to the municipal soup program, logged and verified by the program coordinator. We dated the addendum to the mediation agreement June 28. 2042 privilege reviews became a formal instrument in our family's governance after the success of the June 15, 2037 privilege review that allowed the younger sibling to attend a graduation dinner without a chaperone. The county adopted a template, issued July 10, 2042, for structured privilege reviews that included a mediator-led assessment, written evaluations by impacted parties, and dated sign-offs. The template required that any re-permission to attend ritual events be accompanied by a list of restorative acts and a plan for verifying ongoing compliance. We used the template on September 18, 2042, when the cousin petitioned to attend a memorial reading in person. The review, logged and dated September 18, 2042, granted conditional attendance with a neighbor assigned to serve as a point of contact, a restriction on speeches, and an expectation that the cousin would publicly record a reflection to be archived under the repository's tiered consent dated September 18, 2042. Meanwhile, bureaucratic tenderness continued to be taught in schools. By autumn 2043, the region's middle and high school curricula included an elective titled Boundary Grammar and Community Repair, which referenced our 2029 piloting and included case studies drawn from the repository. The elective was approved by the district on August 7, 2043, and first taught in October 2043. Students practiced drafting dated family statements, mediated role-play exercises, and created pre-flight checklists for events, short, dated documents that clarified who would speak and what technologies would be allowed. The checklists reduced friction at weddings, funerals, and graduations. On 21 August 2044, our family used one such checklist at a wedding for a niece, where many of the lessons from 2003 had been quietly rehearsed. The checklist, dated August 21, 2044, specified that no devices would record the vows, that speakers would be limited to 2 minutes, and that a designated family steward would ensure that any public reading complied with prior consents. The ceremony felt small and careful. The steward kept a dated minute book and afterward filed an entry noting the evening's adherence to the checklist. We filed the minute book entry under August 2044 in the repository. Legal developments kept pace. The state legislature debated a comprehensive statute informed by county pilots and the afterlife representation statute. On September 17, 2044, the legislature passed the Digital Afterlives and Consent Act, which codified requirements for documented consent, platform redress mechanisms, and penalties for unauthorized generative representations. The act explicitly cited the municipal ordinance passed on December 15, 2041, and the Advisory Council report of September 12, 2035. The law took effect on January 1, 2045, and a regulatory framework was published on March 18, 2045 to guide platforms in implementing consent mechanisms. The platforms complied unevenly. Some updated memorial tools and consent forms, while smaller vendors created workarounds. Enforcement, the law's drafters conceded, would require vigilant civil society monitoring. Through these legal and educational shifts, the domestic rituals we had invented persisted. Soup deliveries continued along their quiet timetable. On January 6, 2046, a bowl appeared again on the stoop with a note dated the same day, "For the house. Warm for whoever needs it." We added the entry to the log and photographed it for the archive, as we had done on January 6, 2038. The repetition mattered. The same gesture, across years, accumulated moral weight. When dated and recorded, young people who once asked only about documents inquired, later, about small acts, the bowls, the bouquets, the watering of gates, and sought to replicate them. We had turned tenderness into a form of municipal practice without stripping it of effect. Not every episode ended in neat closure. A dispute in March 2045 over the use of a recorded reading illuminated the limits of law. A regional arts nonprofit had obtained a recorded reading from a private collection and sought to broadcast an excerpt on April 11, 2045, in a commemorative series. We checked the provenance, found it lacking a consent date, and filed a complaint with the nonprofit. On April 12, 2045, the nonprofit withdrew the excerpt on April 20, 2045, and issued a dated apology to affected families. The incident reinforced the need for vigilance. It also taught us that procedural rigor can prompt rapid remedies when public pressure is organized. Family governance adapted to the guardianship, renewed in 2025 and maintained with 6-month reviews, required a policy revision in late 2045 as the elder it protected entered a period of increasing frailty. On November 2, 2045 we convened a medical and legal review, logged it, and submitted an amendment to the guardianship terms on November 15, 2045. To account for changed capacities and for new digital safeguards. Specifically the requirement that any memorial consent signed by the ward be reviewed by a disinterested advocate and dated the document, signed and notarized November 15, 2045, drew on the habit of dated decision-making that had been central to our family practice since 2024. A different generational conversation emerged about memory and forgetting grandchildren who had assisted with indexing the archive in 2037 and who had taught boundary grammar in 2038 now asked in 2046 whether some materials should be sealed for a generation. On April 4, 2046 a family meeting recorded in the log debated whether certain oral histories that named living individuals should be embargoed until 2066. We voted, dated our ballots, and placed an embargo with a specific release date, April 4, 2066. Documenting our intent and the reasoning for future readers, the act honored both transparency and restraint. It acknowledged that a civic archive can also protect those who remain alive. By the end of 2046 the cousin's status had stabilized but remained conditional. On November 30, 2046 we recorded a final, if provisional, privilege review. The cousin could attend certain large family rituals without a designated sponsor and could participate in volunteer leadership subject to quarterly assessments. We dated the review November 30, 2046 and attached an appendix that required continued service, continued counseling, and ongoing probationary restrictions on digital expression. The cousin accepted the terms and acknowledged the record with a dated signature. Looking outward, the regional adoption of consent-first design became a quiet success. Neighborhoods poached our checklists and our dated templates. The county's mediation intake design influenced 3 state agencies between 2042 and 2045. Education's boards taught boundary grammar as civics, yet none of these institutionalizations erased the fact that accountability required daily, often invisible administration. Our family continued to record small non-legal acts. Bowls of soup left on stoops, flowers watered at gates, notes taped to doors, and to file them with dates. These entries, read together, formed a procedural grammar of care that could be taught and audited. We kept teaching. On March 12, 2047 we were invited to present at a statewide convening titled Ritual, Record, and Repair. Our remarks were dated and transcribed. We emphasized one lesson, that administrative apparatus without tenderness is brittle, and tenderness without dates is ephemeral. The organizers' program annotated our talk with references to the 2024 Charter, the March 5, 2033 Amendment, the April 25, 2035 Erratum, and the Repository Policy of October 1, 2037, drawing a through line that connected private grief to public policy. None of this rewrote the memory of 2003. The moment when our parents had told a visiting relative, in a tone both exasperated and protective, "Don't come home, your sister doesn't want you there." That sentence remained in the family lexicon as a coordinate of harm, a brief, sharp map point that explained why we had, later, built forms and mediations and statutes. We told the 2003 story to grandchildren not to rehearse blame but to explain why forms matter, why dates matter, and why small rituals, soup on a stoop, a steward at a wedding, can prevent the mistake of thoughtless return. When we rehearsed that history, we always included the catalogue of responses that followed: the August 30, 2029 mediation document, the letter of November 14, 2029, the relapse noted on November 14, 2032, the privilege review on June 15, 2037, the council report of September 12, 2035, the removal of the synthetic replies on April 1, 2035, and the adoption of formal consent mechanisms on April 20, 2035. The sequence stood as evidence that an initial exile could, in decades, be transformed into a long, conditional pathway back. We held open the possibility that future reckonings would test the mechanisms we had built. On March 2, 2048 we noted in the log a new intake request from an extended family member who had been silent since 2019. The state network scheduled a preliminary meeting for March 18, 2048. We did not assume outcomes. What we did assume, because of the decades of dated records, was that the work would be procedural, documented harms, public and private remedies, conditional privileges, and continued attention to repair. We would continue to keep chairs for those who asked to sit, to leave soup warm for whoever needed it, to index oral histories with precise dates, and to teach the next generation how to translate tenderness into durable, dated practice as new technologies and new hurts inevitably appeared. The March 18, 2048 meeting opened, as scheduled, with the same procedural calm that had characterized our deliberations since 2024. The extended family member, who had been silent since 2019, arrived with a folder of dated documents, a 2016 letter of apology, an unsigned mediation worksheet from 2027, and a recent psychiatric assessment dated February 2, 2048. We recorded the intake on March 2, 2048, as the log required, and the preliminary panel, composed of 2 family stewards, a neighbor point of contact who had served since 2039, and a mediator appointed under the county pilot, met on March 18, 2048. The panel applied the templates that had been refined after the Digital Afterlives and Consent Act of September 17, 2044 and the regulatory guidance of March 18, 2045. The decision, dated March 18, 2048, granted the petitioner provisional attendance at certain family rituals subject to 3 conditions. Enrollment in a 12-month restorative program beginning May 1, 2048. A prohibition on public speaking at all ceremonies until a second privilege review, and the prior submission of a reflective statement to the repository consistent with the tiered consent framework originally. Written on September 18, 2042. We logged the decision, obtained the required dated signature, and scheduled the follow-up review for March 18, 2049. That spring and summer yielded more than family papers. On June 9, 2049, the Governor issued Executive Order 49-12, allocating modest grants to community mediation centers that had sprung up after the county pilots. The order explicitly referenced the county's December 15, 2041 ordinance and the Advisory Council report of September 12, 2035 as evidence that small investments could reduce costly litigation. The State Education Board, which had incorporated boundary grammar and community repair as an elective in middle and high schools on August 7, 2043, expanded the curriculum on May 11, 2049 to include a module for teacher training and a primary school adaptation called Caring Rules, which introduced basic dated consent practices to younger children. Texts and lesson plans carried forward the same case studies we had filed in the repository. The 30 August 2029 mediation document, the letter of November 14, 2029, and the relapse recorded on November 14, 2032 became, for many students, the first time they saw how a sentence spoken in anger could create a procedural afterlife. Platform behavior evolved in fits and starts. On February 4, 2050, the state regulator published a supplemental compliance bulletin that clarified how the Digital Afterlives and Consent Act applied to emergent generative tools. The bulletin required explicit, dated opt-in for any synthetic recreation and established a fast-track takedown for disputed uses. A high-profile enforcement action followed. On July 20, 2050, a small social platform was fined for distributing an unauthorized synthetic monologue inspired by a deceased local artist. The vendor settled and agreed to implement the registry-style consent fields. The bulletin recommended larger platforms, which had been slower to reconfigure legacy memorial features, released updated consent-first APIs by late 2050. The change was uneven, and civil society monitors continued to flag bad actors, but the procedural architecture was now harder to avoid. Our family archive widened in scope. On December 12, 2049, the grandchildren who had indexed the repository in 2037 completed a metadata reconciliation project that linked minute-book entries to audiovisual artifacts, consent records, and hospital notes. The project, logged and dated December 12, 2049, allowed us to display a single-threaded view of any event, who attended, what permissions were given, and what digital artifacts were permitted to persist. This thread proved useful when a documentary filmmaker asked in March 2050 to use excerpts from the 2003 recordings. We checked the provenance against the repository. The 2003 tapes had never included a release. The family declined. The filmmaker retooled the project to use public domain interviews and, on August 1, 2050, released a short film that credited the refusal as an instance of consent culture in practice. Personal rituals continued to be shaped by the forms we had built. I was married on 12 September 2050. The date, chosen after consulting elder availability and cemetery maintenance schedules and recorded in the minute book on March 23, 2050, Saturday. Within a web of administrative choices, our wedding checklist, dated September 12, 2050, was a descendant of the August 21, 2044 template we had used at my niece's wedding. It specified no devices during vows, 2-minute limits for speakers, a steward to monitor compliance, and a neighbor point of contact for any late arrivals. It also required that any family Member whose attendance remained conditional submit their public reflection to the repository 48 hours before the ceremony. The checklist was signed, notarized, and filed. The cousin whose privilege review of November 30th, 2046 had allowed conditional attendance now faced the practical tests of those conditions. He had completed the required counseling but remained under probationary restrictions on digital expression. His public reflection, recorded and timestamped on September 10, 2050 and archived under the repository's tiered consent, was sparse, full of dated acknowledgements and no grand apologies. The panel accepted the reflection on September 11, 2050 and confirmed his attendance for the ceremony with the neighbor point of contact assigned to escort him. We copied the supporting documents into the wedding minute book and noted the steward's duties in bold. On the morning of September 12, 2050 the house hummed with tasks both ancient and newly bureaucratic. Soup was warmed and left on the stoop, dated and photographed as always. 2 bouquets were rehydrated and stamped with a small label showing who had watered them and when. The steward arrived with a minute book and a checklist. The ceremony itself was small and precise. Guests were handed slips that reminded them of the no device rule and of the location of the steward. My parents gave a brief toast that was careful and dry, recounting, in the fashion of our family history, the long road to this day, the August 30th, 2029. Mediation, the council report of September 12, 2035, and the small rituals that had mattered along the way. Halfway through the reception, an elderly relative from out of town, one who had rarely engaged with the family since the 2003 rupture, arrived asking to join the celebration. The arrival was handled according to the checklist. She met with the neighbor point of contact, produced an airline itinerary stamped September 11, 2050, and asked if she could speak my parents, who had told that visiting relative a sentence in 2003. Don't come home, your sister doesn't want you there, repeated, in the quiet of the steward antechamber, a measured variation of the same counsel. They did not shout the line across the reception. They said to the local escort, with familiarity that carried the weight of decades, we will not hold her to what was said then, but we will ask that she honor the restraints of today. The steward reminded the visitor of the 2-minute cap and the prior consent requirement. The visitor, given a copy of the minute book entry and a copy of our September 12, 2050 checklist, chose instead to stay for the dessert but declined to speak later. In the recorded reflections that the steward archived, my parents summarized the choice. They had not turned a person away from food or warmth, but they had preserved the principle that words spoken in the heat of a different time continued to require repair. The phrase from 2003 remained, in the telling, not as a perpetual exile but as a coordinate explaining the labor we had committed to do. The wedding did not end the debates. In 2051 a small controversy arose when a regional festival sought to stage a montage of family reflections on community repair. Organizers requested permission to include my cousin's September 10, 2050 submission. We reviewed the consent designation. His reflection had been archived with a restricted release that permitted family archived viewing but forbade broadcast. The county council issued an advisory opinion on October 3, 2051 that reinforced the registry's tiered consent logic. Citing the Digital Afterlives and Consent Act's emphasis on documented permissions, the festival reworked its montage, and on November 15, 2051 it opened with an explicit acknowledgement of families that had enacted consent first practices. Family governance continued to adapt to the realities of age and of technology. The guardianship that had been renewed in 2025 and amended in November 15, 2045 required another revision when the elder it protected suffered a stroke in June 2052. A medical and legal review convened on June 9, 2052. The family recorded its conclusions on June 14, 2052 and filed an amendment on June 20, 2052, adding a fiduciary requirement that any memorial permission given by the ward be reviewed by 2 disinterested advocates and dated with a timestamp and witness signatures. The amendment cited earlier procedural precedents. The November 15, 2045 notarized amendment and the general practice of dated decision-making that had been central to our family since 2024, and explicitly required that the steward record any change in the minute book within 48 hours. A generational argument resurfaced in late 2053 about sealing materials. On October 2, 2053 the grandchildren proposed an additional embargo for certain diaries and taped interviews that contained unflattering but non-criminal references to living neighbors. The family meeting on October 7, 2053, attended in person by 3 generations and logged in the minute book, debated whether an embargo to January 1, 2080 would serve the public interest and protect private life. After extended discussion we adopted a narrower compromise. An embargo to January 1, 2066 for named local incidents and a conditional review mechanism in 2076. The vote, dated October 7, 2053, referenced the earlier April 4, 2046 embargo decision and noted that our approach balanced transparency with restraint. National conversation kept pace. By mid-2054, legal scholars and civil society groups were arguing that the Digital Afterlives and Consent Act provided a useful template for regulating algorithmic impersonation in other domains. A white paper published on May 20, 2054 by a coalition of universities catalogued the county pilots, the municipal ordinance of December 15, 2041, the State Act of September 17, 2044, and the regulatory guidance of March 18, 2045 as a multi-layered model for harmonizing ethics and enforceability. The paper's authors cited Our Family's Archive as a practical example and quoted from entries in the Minute Book, including the steward accounts from the September 12, 2050 wedding. By the end of 2054, the cousins' trajectory had shifted again. Quarterly assessments, required since November 30, 2046 and reinforced at the Privilege Review in March 2049, demonstrated a pattern of compliance, ongoing counseling, stable employment, and consistent contributions to community service. A review panel convened on November 30, 2054 and, with careful notation, restored a subset of civic privileges: the right to chair a neighborhood volunteer committee, conditional on continuing counseling, and a renewed prohibition on digital impersonations. The decision, dated November 30, 2054, was cautious but significant. It was filed with the repository and cross-referenced to the September 18, 2042 reflection requirement and the June 15, 2037 privilege review. Through these years we learned that the forms we wrote could not substitute for everyday tenderness, the bowls of soup, the bouquets watered on morning schedules, the notes taped to doors, all continued to matter. On January 6, 2055, the day after a heavy snowfall, a neighbor left a pot of stew at our stoop with a note dated the same day, for the family. Warm if you need it. We added the entry to the log and photographed it for the archive, linking the image to previous stoop entries from January 6, 2038 and January 6, 2046. The repetition, the steward observed in his January 7, 2055 Minute Book entry, made the gesture cumulative. The dated succession of small acts created a rhythm of obligation and of care that statutes could not entirely capture. We continued to teach, to revise, to test the limits of our instruments. On March 3, 2055 we were again invited to speak at a symposium, this time national in scope, titled Remembrance, Regulation, and Repair. Our remarks, filed with the organizers and dated March 3, 2055, reiterated the lesson we had offered in March 12, 2047, administrative apparatus without tenderness is brittle. Tenderness without dates is ephemeral. We added an emphasis grown from 2 more decades of practice. Forms themselves are only scaffolding. What endures is the civic muscle of repeated attention, logging, dating, stewarding, that converts fragile care into durable practice. Looking back, the 2003 sentence, the blunt imperative our parents once addressed to a visiting relative, remained a thread through which later practices could be understood. We taught that history to grandchildren, not to serve as perpetual banishment, but to explain why forms, dates, and small rituals persisted. We also taught a countervailing lesson, that the possibility of return, however conditional, should be scaffolded by transparent procedures and by the humility to accept imperfect, incremental repair. As new technologies and new claims emerged, we intended to keep recording minute books, dated checklists, embargoes with clear release dates, and reflections placed deliberately in the registry.